Edit it as we're live.
But I can't edit it without my computer.
We live, y'all.
Hold on.
It says meeting is now streaming on live on Facebook.
I have no idea what the fuck I did.
Here.
Hey, oh, we're still live.
Oh, damn. Why in the world would I see that?
They tried to stop us, but they couldn't. They couldn't. We almost gave up, but we didn't. We didn't. Black Power salute to GG and Chief Rob working this shit out.
Push past your limits and never give up.
I was raging.
Yeah. I want to beat your ass more than shit.
All right, yeah, we live as fuck. Let's get it.
Black Power, comrades. Sorry we are a little bit late, but like I said, the government's always trying to stop us from doing the shit that we need to do. But here we are. Welcome, welcome. Share this live. Share it. And I'm going to go right into the introduction. I'm Chief Z, National Chief of the Political Education and Culture Command. This is the Revolutionary Book Trap. We are continuing our series for War of the Flea, and we are concluding it today in today's book trap. We're going to be covering chapters 9, 10, and 11. And with me is the co-host, Chief Rob. Welcome.
Black Power, y'all. It's your boy Rob, Chief of Agitation and Propaganda. You already know what it is.
Black Power. So we're going to jump right in, and I hope y'all are sharing it and liking it and all the other things to counter whatever algorithms they have in place to like sabotage us. Because fuck the state. Anyways, Chapter 9, a brief summation of Chapter 9 covers basically in mass the failures of the War of the Flea, right? How can these insurrections fail? Because the majority of the book has been talking about the inevitability of winning on part of the guerrilla. And there were certain premises set in place for that victory to take place. And what Robert, goes into depth with in this chapter is really what will cause an insurrection to fail. And essentially, that is separating the guerrilla from the masses, a political victory. And so we're going to dive right into this chapter. And it goes into this, it sets the stage for this by quoting, Mao and the analogy of fish in the water. And so what happens when you take that fish out of the water? It dies, right? It dies. We cover the hooks. We cover the Chinese and Malaya, and also Greece, and why these insurrections failed. So starting with the hook on page 137 of War of the Flea, there were like a few major points in which they kind of lost themselves. First and foremost, if we look at page 37, essentially the state took a quite a smart approach, right? Instead of devoting their army towards hunting down the guerrillas, they have devoted a huge part of their army to this type of like social work, right? While they devoted a small part of the army to hunting down and eliminating the guerrilla forces. And so that was a strategic move, a political move on part of the state to really win the people, right? By like having their armed forces, or really let us call them what they are, right? They're like any form snitches, right? Working with the feds. They they utilize their armed forces to enact social work in mass. and a small part of their army was set out to basically make piecemeal of these guerrillas. So that was the first. That was the first thing. They like, you know, the government set itself up as like, you know, this like social democracy essentially. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rob. Is that what you?
No, that's 100%. I think that we touched on this kind of like phenomenon the last episode that we did, but you're 100% on that. Like the whole concept of guerrilla warfare, the insurgents' main task is to spread rebellion amongst the people and gain their support, right? So in gaining their support, whether that be just passive support or active, like hiding the guerrillas, feeding the guerrillas, shit like that, it has to be clear that when you do that, that the imperialist soldiers or the oppressive government, they are vilified.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? If the guerrilla insurgents are so in tune with the people, they are they're deified, they're like heroic, then by nature, the opposite of that, they're demonized. So in that regard, the oppressive government has to put on a facade of being kind, of having some sort of legitimacy to the people, which wins them away from the guerrilla insurgents. You know what I'm saying? It takes away that power, and that's the fundamental power of the guerrillas, because the whole point is that like when the oppressive government like attacks the guerrillas, the only way that they can survive is if the guerrillas and the people are one. They attack the people at the same time.
And what they did was actually, right, and I say snitch because when we think of, you know, when we think of an army, we think, okay, that's their job, is to serve the state, right? We don't think of medics or teachers or construction workers as an arm of the state when utilized in that way, right? And so, like I said, they designated a significant part of their army to setting up medical stations and building schoolhouses and repairing roads and bridges and quote unquote helping the peasants, right, get their rights to the market. And so to the confused masses, that can seem as though that is like altruistic, right? But we see this type of appeasement that takes place on part of the state more frequently now, right? Because that is a political move, right? Is to appease the masses in these insignificant ways, or significant ways, really, to the masses, but in terms of changing the material conditions, insignificant, in order to, right? Because you can only have one hero and one villain. And so they set themselves up preemptively as the hero by introducing this like social work. And inevitably, right, that ostracizes the guerrilla movement. And it also, you know, as revolutionaries, we identify, you know, those armed forces doing social work as like liberalism, right? As a arm of liberalism and like immediate and individual gain in order to kind of suppress, you know, the masses actually taking over this means of production. They're still allowing the state to operate these means of production in between like disarray and like, you know, revolution and stuff like that, and then like social democracy as it's set up today. So it was a very short, brief talk about the Hucks, because it was a very straightforward strategy on part of the Philippine government.
Yep.
Yeah.
Filipino fighting like Japanese occupation.
Right.
And I want to say that that's right on, because like people people look at these liberal, quote unquote, advancements as progress. But as you see on page 138, in reference to the Hucks, they said that they was unwilling or psychologically unable to take the initiative. They failed to seize and hold the popular imagination.
Yep.
So to create the broad mass unrest needed to topple the government. So we have to be clear about how actually possible it is to create a society with socialist values based on principles that value people over property. Sometimes people do not see that as a possibility, but we have to make that very clear that that is very possible and we can achieve that society. We just have to get rid of the one that is in place right now. Anything other than that is just a perpetuation of that status quo.
And also, right in line with that social work, they offered, right, these like potential guerrillas slash, not necessarily ideologically based, but really in it for the land, right? Because that was their leading slogan, land for the landless. So the government's like, that's it? That's what y'all want? Let me give you your 40 acres and a mule, right? And still continue to do that and exploit you in the same ways because we ultimately own the means of production. And so the government was able to be the political, superior in that sense because they were compromising, right? And so I always question a compromise on behalf of the state, because who are you compromising? Who's going to suffer from that compromise, right? And we see that en masse, right? They can't offer everybody land because all the land would be gone. That is the sole objective, right, of these imperialist forces is to occupy, and as we talked about throughout this book, is to occupy the land. So if they can occupy the land through these puppets, right here, take this land, but you still answer to me, then that really, really puts a challenge towards the guerrilla to essentially adapt to that and then address the needs of the masses. And so I see a huge failing on part of the Hucks in terms of just simply failing to act, failing to respond to those gestures of the government and continuing to move militarily, right? Focusing on the tactical aspects of guerrilla warfare and not the political. So that failure to act was really in the interest of the guerrilla and not in the interest of the masses, which again, there is no guerrilla without the masses. So it would have been in the interest of those individuals.
Yeah, that's 100. I think that it's safe to say if the oppressive capitalist state can give you land, then they can take away land. So at the end of the day, that ain't your shit. It's almost like when you got a car, you whipping this car, but they still repo your ass. That's like a semblance. That's an indicative that we ain't really got no power. You know what I'm saying? That they own that shit.
Yep. And that's exactly the case. And what ends up happening is once they're isolated, their acts of terrorizing this state become seen as like banditry, right? Like there is no moral ground or political ground for them to therefore stand on, right? Because the limited stance or demands that they put forth are being kind of surface level met. So the masses see it as being met, those needs being met, those demands being met. And it is up to the guerrilla to deepen, right? Land to the landless does not mean distribution of private property. It means, right, in mass, right, that we are, the mass is reclaiming control of the land and the means of production and so forth and so on. And so that was as Robert puts it, not this Robert puts it, the failure to act, right?
The sin of the guerrilla.
And moving on, right into Malaya. Tabor goes into this later into this chapter and simply says that they never started out in favor in popular demand. They were already seen as other or ostracized in the indigenous population in the Malayan Peninsula or what have you. And so there was you had the Malayan Racist Liberation Army, but it had very few Malayans, right? It was mostly comprised of, like almost exclusively of Chinese, and more particularly, I'm on page 139, a large squatter population of recent Chinese immigrants. And so the government, again, politically attacks this guerrilla effort through, quote unquote, this like resettlement program, essentially creating ghettos, right? So we have this mass population of like Chinese immigrants, and to appease this population in mass, they again take the social approach of meeting their basic needs, right? Because prior to that was the struggle, right? And the guerrilla effort, the insurrection, came out of the lack of these things. So what does the government do? It provides these quote unquote luxuries in the format of a ghetto, right? So move all these people to this one place where we can watch them and surveil them and police them, but we're gonna give them, a roof over their head and some level of like sustenance, while really killing the insurrection movement. And so that was the first step that the government took to deter insurrection.
Yeah, that's 100%. And they'll definitely, like, from the perspective of the impoverished people, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's fairly winning. Like, we could sit here and talk about like socialist ideology all day, but if you're not supporting the masses in some sort of way, then what is it that you're doing? And this really exposes that fault. You know what I'm saying? Some people are just hungry. You need to, before you start talking about like Mao and all shit like that, you should probably feed the fucking people if you claim to be in service of them. Or the other option is that the imperialist or the capitalist oppressive regime will take up that mantle, use that strategy or whatever to maintain their hierarchical structure.
Yeah, I think that's the fine balance that we have to find, right? Identifying the overarching needs of the masses, but also making sure that as we are meeting those needs, or coming into conversation with those needs that need to be met, we're also grounding it in an ideological truth, right? So even if the state comes in with these these nonprofits, this social work, there is an answer that we have to provide to that political movement attack on part of the state, right? Like even if we're looking at the United States and the type of social work that's happening, we have to present the contradiction that there is an abundance of food. There is an abundance of resources, yet they are giving you these scraps. Understand them as scraps, right? So even if the state is providing these scraps so to maintain that sustenance of the labor force, we are also still able to organize and unite with that labor force, right? Unlike, the Hucks, who were just like, we ain't got no land. Essentially, we ain't got the resources, and we need the resource. So when the resources was handed to them, that was the end of that insurrection, right? That was the end of that conversation, because it was not deepened.
True.
And so, yeah, so the resettlement program, which essentially cut off the MRLA from the people. I mean, that was an immediate effect that happened, because they literally moved they resettle these entire immigrant populations into different, essentially, ghettos. That word is often used as a adjective, but it ain't an adjective. It's a noun, a place. Right? And on page 141 at the bottom, it says 9 months of continuous effort by an entire battalion backed by artillery and aircraft, with the expenditure of more artillery and mortar shells and aerial bombs than exist in the arsenals of some Latin American republics, to eliminate 35 guerrillas. So even still, even with that separation, it exposed the weakness of the state, right? They put they put a lot of effort and energy in hunting down and eliminating these 35 guerrillas that remained after they got separated. And the only reason they were successful was because they politically cut them off from the people, but they also were able to, through that political severing, cut them off from the material goods they needed to actually live and survive. And so it provides a opportunity for imagination for these other countries. And Robert goes on to say that even with the hopelessness of that insurrection, it certainly hastened the independence of Malaya by years. So good lesson to learn there.
Right on. The strength of the guerrilla is still shown in its way of like evading the tactics. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And that's like the military strategy of it all. Like militarily, you still have that advantage, but politically, which is the primary focus, if you don't unite with the people, then the movement is compromised.
And that's such an essential point and theme throughout this book, is like, yes, there are like very practical military strategies that have been taken up by the guerrilla that have shown to be effective, but are only strategies that are available to them when utilized when utilized within a political setting, right? The politic of it is what defines the guerrilla before the guerrilla can pick up on any of these tactics, right? Right. You're not defined as guerrilla. You're defined as a bandit, or you're defined as a terrorist, or you're defined as these things when you have that separation from the mass.
Yep.
That's such a critical point. And then the rest of this chapter is pretty much taken up by Greece. You know how I feel about, we talked about this last time, but what have you. Still good points to learn. I think it's funny / not funny, but he essentially starts it out. It's like Greece insurrection is the example of how not to conduct guerrilla war. It's like, don't do it this way. They were just doing their own shit. And there's a few different points that I want to touch on that I think are worth noting, in not only as Greece is like this group of people who want to have that access to whiteness, and maybe even today, right, some 60 some years later, still are much closer to accessing that like colonial power, if not half, right? An extension of. And so he's pointing this out back in 65, where they had the advantage. They had quite the advantage. And when they had that advantage, they began to occupy land rather than continue the guerrilla effort to unite the mass. And I believe it was in the north, where once they had enough of the government retreating, they began to occupy that land. They occupied that land by, like, for lack of a better term, raping and pillaging the rural population. They would go through and clear out rural towns, and it created this refugee population that kind of ran from that, which I'm sure ignited more government popularity. And so on page 144, it says the Democratic Army's initial strength had been about 2,500. At its peak, it reached 26,000 after declining to some 18,500 towards the end of the war. The first early success and other factors, the support given by Athens, the British, and the Americans, and that given the Democratic Army by the three communist countries north of the border, led to serious, indeed fatal errors. The first was to lose effective contact with the Greek population. If you ain't got no mass supporting you, you ain't shit. You ain't shit but a thorn in their thumb, a thorn in their something, ass. I don't know. Whatever. I want to hear what you I want to hear what you think about that though. I did say raping and pillaging, but that was my takeaway from this book, not from, outside.
What do you mean you want to hear about Greece specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah. This kind of struggle, like, regardless of its like communist nature, it's still ingrained in having these kind of like colonial ties. Because like just because your economy is based in your population having like owning the means of production doesn't mean that it isn't oppressive to people in the quote unquote third world. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that that's right on when you say like when this book like goes into like the European struggle, it's obviously like kind of daunting. It's like I don't even want to fucking like go into the details of all this or whatever. But that tactic of Greece like occupying land, it's like what else do white people do besides fucking occupy land that they're not supposed to be on, bro? Instead of like uniting with the people, they went to occupy land.
Yep, like, by force. And by force, they mean for reasons relating perhaps partly to political security, partly to simple material expedience. The communists early in the campaign began to raid the villages from which the gendarmes, I don't know how to say that word, had been driven, and to strip them of their cattle, their food supply, and eventually of their inhabitants. The latter being either forcibly inducted into the Democratic Army or driven out of the guerrilla-based areas entirely. And I want to like zero in on that. Like, essentially, they're like, we here fighting for your freedom, so give us your shit and like get the fuck out the way or join our efforts. And that's exactly what these colonial forces do, right? They take this like high ground, and you hadn't got no high ground. I mean, so like as a guerrilla, like you could take it to the mountains, but like I guess metaphorically, you don't have this high ground that you're taking in opposition to the people, right? You have to unite the masses to the causes that should indeed be in their interest, right? And so to go in and say, like, give us your shit because we're fighting for you, or we're fighting for, right, this communist, right, agenda, is essentially doing the same thing as like, as like the United Snakes when they're like, we're fighting for democracy for everybody and we're gonna force you to eat this shit, right? It's not a good tactic. It's not a good tactic, as the Greece will show. It's not. It didn't work.
Yeah, I think in later chapters it goes to show. It says that like you can't be opportunistic in your approach. That like if I would say that as a guerrilla, and I think that this book speaks to that you do have the moral high ground, and you have to claim that moral high ground, but you have to be about it too. You actually have to be like you have to like make yourself like a caricature of virtue, because if not, people will not fuck with you. Like you'll just be another military occupant. You know what I mean?
Because and they get into that in the next chapter, exactly, to like, you might be quoting them.
I'm jumping ahead. We already on.
But they get to that point, and that's exactly why. And that moral high ground again is not to wave in the face of the people.
Yeah.
It's to exemplify and to highlight all of the failures of the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is an opposition of the state and not of the people. It's not to say we out here fighting for the people and you ain't shit because you were part of the people and you ain't fighting for the people. It's to say we out here fighting for the people on this moral basis, and look what the state is not doing for you. This is not a government that is for you. This is not a government that is in the interest of people. And you could talk about it all day long, like you said, but if you're not about it when it comes down to, right, it's that, like, I think it's probably some white person who came up with this, a means to an end, right? The means justifies the end. Like we came here to fight for victory. So if we have to, push out, masses of people, then it's justified because ultimately we are fighting for a free Greece. Like, no, you must, as a revolutionary, as a guerrilla fighter, stand on that moral ground in hopes to bring the mass on that ground with you.
We got some comments. So Diva said, when Fannie Lou Hamer was interviewed by this cracker on the stance of her party, the Freedom Democratic Movement, about the Vietnam War, like this cracker was trying to embarrass and stump Fannie Lou with all these fucking questions. When he asked her about Vietnam, she said, how is America trying to clean up somebody else's house when their house is dirty? Woo! Damn. Period.
Put
it on him. Super powerful. I also got some quotes or whatever. So on 147, the last paragraph says, the object of the guerrilla is not to win battles, but to avoid defeat, not to end war, but to prolong it until the political victory is more important than any battlefield victory has been won. So with their stance of like furthering the military struggle, you know what I'm saying? They tried to occupy land, like they were gonna sit there and like fight off like hordes of fucking armies and shit. By them doing that, they compromised the political. You know what I'm saying? They wanted to end the war quicker.
Yep.
And that just ended the war for them. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So we have to understand as revolutionaries right now that we in this bitch for the long run. Like we have to move in a way that sustains us, as opposed to like accelerate the whole process. You know what I mean?
Yep.
That is not to say that like, oh, we're gonna vote for Bernie Sanders, we're trying to play the long game because like motherfuckers say that, but like because we're politically astute, we see through that shit. But we have to push the level of struggle to a higher level. You know what I'm saying? But without accelerating to that point where you're militarily defeated.
And that just goes back to the same principle, right? It is not to say that you have to follow a step-by-step process, but as a guerrilla, you have to have a level of being able to adapt to the circumstances. And in the case of, the Hucks that failed to act, the MRLA that, failed to unite the masses. And in this case, with the Greek that really also kind of failed to act and or rush to the victory that wasn't yet seized. And they all, didn't stay principled as guerrillas, which was primarily political in gaining the masses, but also in guerrilla tactics. And they rushing to get these resources, and you stepping on the niggas that you're supposed to be supporting while doing that. And he concludes the chapter with saying, revolution is by definition a mass phenomenon. Greece, Malaya, the Philippines all illustrate the axiom that without mass participation, or at least popular support, there can be no revolution. The Hucks lost it, the Chinese and Malaya never had it, and the Greek communists threw it away.
He's dead ass like roasting them at this point.
Huh?
He's dead ass like roasting them at this point.
Oh, for sure.
The Greek lost it. Malaysians never had it. They never had the juice.
And they threw it. The Greek communists threw it away because, again, they had the military advantage, right? And had they continued to stay principled to their guerrilla tactics, they could have seized all of Greece. They could have continued to move that line forward, but instead they emulated, right, these colonial forces by trying to occupy land and by doing so through force. And so that ain't principle. That ain't getting to the basic principles of that insurrection. And so that chapter sets us up perfectly for this next chapter, in which we go right into Sun Tzu, which is a very old like war expert in terms of tactics. Mao oftentimes references, his essays on the art of war. I'm sure many of you have also heard of or read or what have you, The Art of War. That's Sun Tzu. And I think it's worthwhile to just read this little excerpt at the top of the chapter. All warfare is based on deception. Therefore, when capable, feign incapacity. When active, inactivity, right? So be sneaky. Even if you got the means, shut the fuck up and keep pretend that you don't, right? When you doing shit, act like you ain't doing shit. When near, make it appear that you are far away. When far away, that you are near. Offer the enemy a bait to lure him. Feign disorder and strike him. When he concentrates, prepare against him. Where he is strong, avoid him. Anger his general and confuse him. Pretend inferiority and encourage his arrogance. Keep him under a strain and wear him down. When he is united, divide him. Attack where he is unprepared. Sally out when he does not expect you. These are the strategist key to victory. And this is mad old. This is mad old. This shit ain't changed. And he gets right into why this shit ain't changed. Why this shit is still relevant. Why this shit is like principles of warfare. Which he goes into on page 150. The principles of warfare are not modern, but ancient. They were well established when Caesar marched out on his first campaign. You look like you're thinking. What you thinking?
I'm always thinking.
And he gets into like the fact that technology is constantly advancing, but technology is not what wins wars, right? And I think oftentimes we look at, these Western powers and like, oh my God, they got nuclear weapons. Like we can't never win against nuclear weapons, but they need us more than we need them. And that is something that we use as guerrillas to our advantage, is that sure, they could bomb the fuck out the whole motherfucking world. We all could be fucking gone tomorrow if they wanted us to be gone. But then they got to wipe their own asses and feed their own children. And they ain't trying to do that. They have shown, these fucking Western powers have shown that it don't matter the case, the situation, or what have you. They refuse to do the work that they need to do for themselves and are dependent, not out of choice, but out of necessity on the backs and the labor of colonized people. So there are instances in which that is not the case. There have been instances in which that is not the case, but that is in the instances in which we are still divided as colonized people and not united under colonized nation, as colonized people. So we're going to get into this chapter, keep it moving.
This chapter was fucking awesome. I love it. There's a lot of, maybe best chapter? Maybe. But there's a lot of, like kind of like military know-how and like how he explains that like that technology is like it's fucking scary, but it does not win wars. Like and even the people who oppress you know that shit. And we're dealing with crazy technology. Like fuck the nuclear bomb, dude.
Right.
Like robots, bitch. That Black Mirror shit, that shit got me fucked up. But that's just the reality of this kind of like acceleration of oppressive means. You know what I'm saying? But here in page 152, it says the means are not important. The important element is the leadership itself. Bandits are not revolutionaries. Looters are not guerrillas. In order to attract a following, the revolutionary leaders must stand firm on moral ground. They must have some greater purpose than the furtherance of personal ambition. So like we have to supersede all these like incidental like things of like technology, because like the goal itself, like we have to be so one to that goal, into like a free fucking world, that like all these fucking robots and all this crazy shit that they got to fuck us up, like it don't even fucking matter. You know, someone will pick up our guns and move us. You know what I'm saying? Move it forward. Yeah.
And on page 150, he says the guerrilla is a political insurgent. And I think that sentence put it pretty plain, right? There is a military aspect to it, but to understand how the guerrilla is a political insurgent, the conscious agent of revolution. I want to find that specific quote that
conscious. It's like at the bottom. His military role, while vital, is only incidental to his political mission.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Each battle will be a lesson designed to demonstrate the impotence of the army and so to discredit the government that employs it. That shit I really fuck with. Like I love that idea, because there's also text on like from Mao that says that like guerrilla warfare is not something that can just be fucking like read about. Like we're reading about it right now, we're intrigued in it, we're learning about it from this perspective, but we won't know shit until we really out in the fucking trenches. I know that there's like people who like just want to fucking like read books all the time, but like there's gonna be a point where you can't tell me nothing. There's gonna be a point where we're gonna really be out there and you can't be like, well, on page 158 it says to do this, so we gonna do that. Like no. We have to be materialist, engage with it, with how it is. Like if we in the modern day are dealing with like crazy technology or whatever, like how we are, we have to subvert that shit to show that that technology really ain't shit. Right. You know what I mean?
That technology is still in the hands of, and he goes to say, you know, they're just intellectually not. The guerrilla has the intellectual advantage, right? So regardless of the technology that these governing bodies have to stamp out these insurrections, they don't have the intellectual capacity, right, to defeat the guerrilla. And I mean that in the sense that, like, regardless of the weaponry and what have you that they have, not only are the guerrilla more adapt to the plains, the terrain that they're operating in, they're also more in tune with the people, right? They're more in tune with the people, and that is just not capable. I mean, as much as, you know, Obama was like smooth talking and shit like that, this nigga ain't never suffered a goddamn day in his life. And we can look at Trump, and it is just stark, the difference between this bourgeoisie class, this ruling class, and the masses. And that has not changed in time or space. That separation that is created, that creates this oppression, is exactly that the disadvantage that they have. They don't know shit other than what they are getting from the masses. And if we are the mass and we lead in the mass revolution, we can feed them whatever the hell we want. But yes, he also says on page 151, these factors. So I want to give a little context. Obviously, none successful insurgency presupposes the existence of valid popular grievances, sharp social divisions, an unsound or stagnant economy, and oppressive government. These factors obtaining, revolution will still be far off unless there exists or comes into existence the nucleus of a revolutionary organization capable of articulating and exploiting popular dissatisfaction with the status quo. The long tyrannized peasant, for example, is seldom as revolutionary as the relatively fortunate student or worker who has been led to believe that he has rights and finds in a change of political climate that he is deprived of them. And so, again, y'all middle class adjacent Negroes out here thinking that, you know, you are going to get a seat at that table with hard work and the right college degree and or, you know, the right amount of capitalist endeavors. You will come to a point when you realize that you will not. And a lot of what he's saying here is that disillusionment needs to come right in hand with a revolutionary nucleus, right? That again, so we don't have, you know, just a bout of liberal bourgeoisie bullshit, right? The middle class trying to become the bourgeoisie, but really uniting that quote unquote middle class adjacent with the masses of laborers, with the masses to show that you're more likely to gain that security, that prosperity, that egalitarianism that you're trying to acquire through your capitalist means, actually through a revolution. You're more likely to have that success as a revolutionary in the success of a revolution than you are to be given a seat at the table, right? And he says any sort of social conflict. And I thought this was interesting because this is written in fucking 1965. And this shit is just like so very relevant that there brings about this truth that is like universal. So any sort of conflict, a strike, an election campaign, a dispute over land or wages or prices or rents or schools or any one of the score of social problems often they will come in reaction to some act of repression or real or fancy injustice on part of the governing authorities, as for example, when the efforts of the police to curb popular demonstration turned the demonstration into a riot, right? And that's just the first stage, right? That is just a symptom of this mass disarray or dissatisfaction with these governing bodies. And as, you know, as a revolutionary nucleus, I like that term. It is the job of the guerrilla to, in some sense, you know, deliberately create disorder, right? By deliberate acts, the revolutionary nucleus proclaiming its defiance of authority and banking on this popular support. So, in essence, understanding that this shit is happening, people are like all dissatisfied and shit like that, and it is a job of the revolutionary to act upon that, right? Act upon that dissatisfaction in an open declaration of revolutionary war. And the revolutionary leaders must stand on firm, like you said, on firm moral ground. They must have some greater purpose. And this in turn implies an ideology or a clear cause to explain their decisions and the reasons for their insurgency. And so in essence, right, again, he puts on the revolutionary or on the guerrilla to take advantage or to exploit popular support. And we need to be in tune with the masses to understand when that support is going to be available, right? Sometimes people be jumping the gun, right? And you left out on your ass because you weren't really in tune, or you wait and you miss that opportunity, right, to gain mass support in terms of the cause or the ideology that you're putting forth as a revolutionary nucleus. I'm gonna pause there. And do you have any comments?
That's 100. I 100% unite, and it's a lot. It's like very much so, like, damn. How do I put this nicely? Because we organize with a lot of people, but there is a certain strand of a certain strata of quote unquote leftists or socialists or insurrectionary that believes that you can just cause disarray amongst the people, and that revolutionary will occur naturally out of that. It's the anarchist line that like general dissidents and shit like that is enough to topple this fucking organized government, and it's fucking not. Like, revolutions do not happen by accident. If you can define a revolutionary nucleus, you know what I'm saying? Something that's like
Leading,
something that is like centered or like ideologically in front of the masses to guide them.
Yep.
That's pointing to a kind of like organized hierarchical structure. Does that make sense? Like some sort of
leadership.
A leadership, exactly. Exactly. So people think that that in itself is a oppressive relationship, which I do not unite with at all. It is just strategic, and it's a matter of how much you want it. You know what I'm saying? Like, with all my being, I want to be that fucking revolutionary nucleus, because we're not just gonna be like, oh, revolution will come whenever. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So somebody got to take the lead, and to create these kind of to understand what these circumstances are, and they do lay it out, like what are the
requisites.
Yeah, the prerequisites of revolution, and someone's got to take a stand, take a lead, and like move the masses in that direction. You know,
and he gets
so that's what I think.
And he gets really specific with that, Rob. He proceeds to say on page 152, when conflict occurs, whether spontaneous or induced, the revolutionary leaders must be capable of explaining and rationalizing its confused and often apparently accidental character, right? The coronavirus ain't it may seem spontaneous, it may seem accidental, but as revolutionaries, we have to understand that, one, there have been biological arms of these militarized governments that have been crafting, right, specific viruses and biological agents that are intentionally trying to harm the masses. So even if it didn't come from that biological arm, the fact that there is a lack of response in 2020 to this agent, to this biological agent that is harming the masses of people, the fact that the government has not been prepared, given the history of viral outbreaks and the harm that is done to the masses, it's like, well, what the hell have y'all been spending our goddamn tax money on, right? And as a revolutionary, we have to come to the table, to this conversation, being able to explain and rationalize why this shit ain't accidental, why this shit is predictable, right? And has been predicted, and we can continue to predict the movements of this government. And he goes on to say, isolated acts of defiance must be given coherency within a revolutionary frame of reference. The leadership must be prepared to make the most of every opportunity to accelerate the process of social ferment and political disruption. The first task of revolutionary cadres must be to relate each incident and each phase of the conflict to a greater cause, or to a great cause, so that revolutionary violence is seen as the natural and moral means to a desired end, and the masses of the people are increasingly involved. The struggle cannot be allowed to seem meaningless or chaotic. It must be given a progressive character, as in, like you were saying, there has to be something heading. There has to be a trajectory, and that whether that trajectory is that ideology or it has to be, right? There can't be like this anarchist, like, hey, everybody kind of do what we do. Because if we look at that as a model, right, it's like this, right? It's just any which direction. There has to be a progression, right? Which and to have a progression, you need a trajectory, a leading body. And it must arouse great expectations and appear crucial at every stage so that no one can stand outside of it. And so Black Hammer is really jumping on the gun, jumping on ahead of everything that's taking place right now. We are coming forth with not only information, but also we are making sure we are inserting ourselves as crucial to the masses, right? We are putting out mask, equipment, information, and soon to be on the ground providing material resources for the people, so that when and if this dust settles, we obviously will be setting the stage as like a crucial and integral part of this effort. But yeah, that's just the nature that coherency is in direct opposition to like the ideal anarchist situation, you know?
You're
contradictory.
So I wanna get your feedback on this. Like, if you read the prerequisites, how many of the prerequisites do you think that we've achieved? I'm gonna lay them out.
Read them. Oh, you can't see my book because
no, I got you. These are the prerequisites, and y'all let me know on the comments too how many you think we got. 1, an unstable political situation marked by sharp social divisions and usually, but not always, by a foundering or stagnant economy. 2, a political objective based on firm moral and ideological grounds that can be understood and accepted by the majority as the overriding cause of insurgency, desirable in itself and worthy of any sacrifice. 3, an oppressive government in which no political compromise is possible. 4, some form of revolutionary political organization capable of dedicated and consistent leadership towards the accepted goal. We know we got that. The last requirement, the clear possibility or probability of success. Until people believe that a government can be overthrown, it must be the first act of the insurgency to demonstrate this possibility by successful defiance of military force. The attempt will not be made. The revolutionary following will not be found. What do you think? You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think number 1, an unstable political situation, like we definitely got that. We 100% got that. There's social dissidence, there's a bunch of fucking social problems, and there's also economic problems brewing if they're not already here. 2, a political objective based on firm moral and ideological grounds. I don't think that we got that. But I think that a few of us do. Like, and I don't think that socialism is that kind of, although it's appealing to most people, I would say that decolonization is getting more popular and is becoming that prerequisite, but not a lot of people are ones of that. Or even less, not a lot of people can describe how that looks like.
Yes.
3, an oppressive government which no political compromise is possible. I know that you laughed when I said that shit because it seems like it's obvious that we have that fucking that government, but we don't. Because a lot of people think that the government, this one, still has like legitimacy in the shape of like Bernie Sanders and like fucking Joe Biden's delusional ass. 4, some sort of political organization capable of providing dedicated, consistent leadership towards the accepted goal. I would say, as a proud member of Black Hammer, that's us, baby boy. Like, let's be real. And we're only growing stronger, and we're only becoming more brilliant, and we're only fucking, you know what I'm saying? Like, we have all these things to like train us to become like that political nucleus. No arrogance or whatever, but that's what we're doing. And then with the clear possibility or probability of success, that is clear to me. That probably is clear to you and a bunch of our other
comrades.
Yeah, our cadre. But do the masses think that? I would say no. I think that they're scared. Not probably like not people in the hood and shit. Like that's why we believe the colonized proletariat is the proletariat, the producing class and revolutionary class, because like people in the hood, the people in the barrios, people in the concentration camps known as reservations or whatever, like they already live in this oppressed state. Like there's a part in this book where it talks about how like, people are gonna like, we're gonna have to like attack the electric grid. People are gonna have to go without water, go without light, without access to food. And it's like, bitch, that's how you just described the hood. Like we have to capitalize on that, and like our people, because of this bullshit colonial system, have been put through this kind of through these conditions anyway. So we might as well see it through and overturn the government with that ability. Like white people eating Cheetos and like Hot Pockets and shit, like playing PlayStation. Like if the guerrilla insurgent like turns off their fucking electricity, they're gonna be like, what the fuck? You know what I'm saying? Like they're not gonna be like up in arms and shit like that. Like, but yeah, back to the prerequisites. I would say that we have two.
2 out of 5.
2 out of 5.
It's failing grade. I would say that, so let me kind of lead with the fact that this is a list of prerequisites, right? This list was, right, put into this book in 1965, when this book was written. And none of these things on this list seem unachievable. I will start with that. Nothing seems out of reach. They seem quite achievable. And I think as cadre, essentially as anybody attempting to be a part of the leading body of any type of revolutionary work, should take a look at this prerequisite and really break it down, because it's different components to each one of these prerequisites. For instance, 1, an unstable political situation marked by social divisions and usually, but not always, by a foundering or stagnant economy. So like Rob said, I unite. That's step 1. All components of this is met. It's been met. It's going to stay met, because we know the shit ain't getting no better no time soon. In fact, we probably are heading right into a depression, which will further that fucked up economy. 2, a political objective based on firm moral and ideological grounds that can be understood and accepted by the majority as the overriding cause of the insurgency, desirable in itself and worthy of any sacrifice. That's a lot of components, right? But if we break it down, we got parts and pieces, and we need to observe what parts and pieces we don't got. I think a political objective. I agree with you, Rob. I think that there is a political objective, decolonization, as Black Hammers particularly, but decolonization is certainly something that is based on firm moral and ideological grounds. And I think we are working towards that unity, right? That understanding and acceptance by the majority. That is what we are working on. We got the whole motherfucking pet command, right? Political education and culture, right? We are unifying us through enlightening people to these contradictions and allowing them to understand that their interests are invested in that political objective, right? And then it says, desirable in itself and worthy of any sacrifice. He separates that out on purpose. You know, you can accept something and you can understand it. That don't mean you're gonna be willing to die for it, right? And so we have to understand the conditions and not even the conditions. When people think about advertising, there's a target audience. There is a target audience for a reason, right? It's going to appeal to certain people for a reason, right? And I think as revolutionaries, we have to identify who that mass is and how to expand that, right? So like these motherfuckers in the ghettos who ain't got this shit anyway, who out here struggling to get their basic needs met, which is the mass of us, right? That is an immediate. There is right. There is just a need for that political education, that political objective, and then we can create that unity, right? And then we can expand past that to, you know, the liberal bourgeoisie who think they about to get, you know, some shit over here, but really they not. And so they kind of in the background. They're not who our first appeal is to. And then you got the, you know, number 3, an oppressive government. We got a motherfucking oppressive government, but with which no political compromise is possible, right? As I will speak personally, I ain't compromising with this motherfucking government unless they are offering to hand over their military control of the world. And that's a compromise I'm sure they are not willing to make. So in my mind, this is met, right? In my mind, yes, we have this. However, you know, there needs to be a broad understanding, a mass understanding that that's the case. Number 4, you know, some form of revolutionary political organization capable of providing dedicated and consistent leadership toward the accepted goal. So this is obviously in reference to previously set prerequisites in terms of what that accepted goal will be. But, you know, assuming the other prerequisites are met, yes, I believe we do. We do have leading bodies that are capable and quite motherfucking dedicated to that. And then finally, the clear possibility or even probability of success. Until the people believe that the government can be overthrown, it must be the first act of the insurgency to demonstrate this possibility. So, not only does it tell you what the prereq is, it tells you that if it ain't met, this is what the fuck you got to do. So if there is a doubt in the mind of the people that the people have the power, then we must show the people that we got the motherfucking power. We got to show the people. And so stay tuned. I'm just kidding. Only just a little bit. Yeah, no. So, I mean, I would say in all, you know, we have the makings of all 5. There is like solid points within each of those prerequisites that we have solidly. We got that shit. Now, do we meet the entirety of the prerequisite? I don't think so. I think that there could be more work done. And I think that there are active people working to meet those prerequisites somewhere in the world, somehow, some way, whatever. But yes. But the, you know, he says plainly, the guerrilla is above all else an improviser, right? We see what ain't being met, we fucking improvise, right? We improvise. So that certainly is not to deter any type of revolution. These prerequisites are not a deterrent. If anything, they're like, let us make it real simple.
Hashtag goals.
Hashtag. Okay. Yes. No. I'm so happy you went to that, and that was definitely any comments on that in the comments. I mean, that's insightful. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't feel like they hearing us. I mean, some people are fucking with us, but in reference to the coronavirus, someone named JS says, so this saying, even if it was not a human-made virus, a method with which they, colonizers and the powers that they have instilled, handled proactively protecting people, i.e. lots and lots of educated and informed leaders. spelled out this was going to be happening for nearly 20 years, but no one did anything because it would be resource spent on unworthy populations, and retroactively caring for people, focusing the care to the first world nations can be so selective in a direct line between class, race, theology, and can dependably predict on who will and who will not be safe from harm. Yo, that is 100. So yeah, like even if they didn't fucking create it in a lab, which they did, it still can be weaponized against colonized people.
Facts.
So some people be like extra vulnerable people or discontent masses. Like, no, we just colonized.
Facts.
But yes. This chapter is the fucking shit.
It is the shit, and which is why we spending so much fucking time on this chapter in particular. But there's just so much shit in here, and so he sets the stage in the beginning of this chapter of like what's needed, and then he also begins to identify some of the disadvantages or perhaps obstacles rather that guerrillas will come up against, and he starts this. I just want to give a little bit more, just one more quote to like boost us up, and he says on page 155, after quoting Sun Tzu, the enemy must not know where I intend to give battle, for if he does not know where I intend to give battle, he must be prepared. He must prepare in great many places. And when he prepares in a great many places, those I have to fight in any one place will be few. And when he prepares everywhere, he will be weak everywhere. The foregoing explains, as well as anything that has ever been written, how it is possible for a relative handful of armed men to oppose a vastly superior army. The secrets of success are first, superior intelligence, and second, terrain. Guerrillas representing a popular cause have the tremendous advantage of intelligence service that encompasses virtually the entire population. The population hides them. At the same time, it reveals from day to day and hour to hour the disposition and strength of the enemy.
100.
Before you get into that disadvantages or obstacles. And you want to comment on that, Rob?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well.
Cool. And so moving on, obviously we've touched on some of the obstacles in terms of the guerrilla is that we must maintain contact with the masses, be of the masses. But I think in particular, I'm thinking about these like Western nations, these quote unquote developed nations, etc. And some of the emphasis is on the terrain, right? It's not just the intelligence or the connection with the masses, but it's also the fact that we are familiar with our terrain. And he talks a lot about rural, right? These like rural spaces that may surround these like quote unquote urban and or just like highly dense or densely populated non-industrial towns as the advantage of the guerrilla. And it's on page 156. The greater the area of operations, the more difficult it will be for the army to locate guerrillas, and the more the government will have to disperse its troops and extend its line of supply and communication. So a foundational thing for this strategy, right, is space, right? Space and terrain and adapting to that terrain. And if we know, just for example, United States, for instance, right, is almost centered around its urban centers, right? Most of the cities that you know by name are really urban centers and are highly populated by African colonized people. Majority, right? And then you have all this space in between that's like these rural areas, rural populations that are highly populated, not exclusively, but highly populated by like colonizers, white people. And I think we have to be aware of that in the sense that these motherfuckers is hostile. This is probably where you get the dominant, supply of hostile like white nationalists. It's from these like outside of these urban centers, whether that's suburban and or rural areas. And so we have to be conscious that ain't our terrain, right? Our terrain in the United States is these urban centers. We know this more than anything. He goes into it. He says 157, even in well-policed large cities, a sympathetic population can protect active insurgents, right? So that was like an obstacle, but it's not really a disadvantage. It's like an obstacle.
I feel like once you really like learn like dialectical materialism or whatever, every time someone says that there's a problem, I understand it as a solution, because what you just laid out doesn't seem like a disadvantage to me at all. If colonized people occupy the urban centers, then that means that we fundamentally occupy the nerves of the body of the oppressive construct of the United Snakes. And that puts us in a very
advantageous
position, hypothetically,
of course, right? And so to dive into why are these urban centers the nerve, as Rob put it, it's important to understand that, like, right, in quote unquote developing nations, the predominant production that is happening are in their rural centers, right? Their rural spaces. However, the United Snakes, these motherfuckers have industrialized the entire country, where the majority of the work, right, what we see is people flooding into these urban centers. So essentially they are, right, that nucleus or nuclei, essentially, that function, that makes this country function, right? Without that, with a lapse in that, there is almost a cease for the country to exist, right? If New York or wherever were to stop, were to be seized, were to be separated from the rest of the country for whatever reasons, it will be almost fatal to the United States government, that hypothetically. And I agree with you, Rob. It is to the advantage of who may be interested in that type of guerrilla tactic that, you know, this country is set up that way. But it's also important to note that urban centers, urban populations can easily be starved and terrorized into submission. Why? Because one, it is size-wise, it's just not a huge expanse of space. Also, there are a lot of roads and less coverage, right? They get rid of our trees, they get rid of our everything. You got lampposts with cameras on every corner, and they can easily mobilize forces within these urban centers. Sure, they can easily, but like I said, going back to, you know, what Sun Tzu said, and when he prepares everywhere, he will be weak everywhere, right? And just keep that in mind. Just keep that in mind. I think we can draw our own conclusions about that in terms of, you know, specifically or hypothetically the United States, and in terms of mobilization of troops. I mean, we can see that now, right, in this COVID-19 issue, right? They cannot, they do not have the capacity to mobilize heavily in every city, in every urban city. Locally, the local police force, nor do the National Guard or any military aid that they may receive. They don't have the capacity to do that unless they were, and even if they were to withdraw from every colonized nation that was in the world, they still would not have the capacity to adequately mobilize and occupy the cities in the United States. They wouldn't. And if they did, it would be like 10 people. It would be like it would be a stark disadvantage for them to do that. Yeah, so like I said, disadvantage in quotes in such instances. But yeah, these last few chapters are like so dope, and
yeah, they're so fucking awesome.
But it's only been about an hour and a half, so I just want to get a little bit more out of the chapter, and we're gonna move on to the concluding chapter and keep it going. He goes on to talk a little bit about strategy. He, for instance, on page 158, he talks about concealment, deterrent factor, guerrilla work. In larger towns, indicating the highways and cutting communication power lines, operating in squads of 3 to 8 men, striking from ambush and then quickly hiding in the brush, or at times in the homes of residents. We see that like underground railroad system necessary, right? Having that, again, that connection with the mass is essential in these hypothetical situations. When an active guerrilla column grows beyond the 100 or so, it should then be divided. So again, making sure that we are not trying to build essentially a parallel army, but we are sticking to our principal guerrilla tactics of evasion and then, attack when the opportunity presents itself. And any type of rebellious activity or what have you must be the object of national attention, too shocking in its initial effects to be ignored by even controlled press. I mean, this was written in 65. I cannot reiterate that enough. Or quickly explained away, as has been the case with abortive provincial insurrections by the government, safe with untroubled capital far from. And so when I think about St. Louis and that shit, they shut media down, right? They tried to like blind and what have you in order to do the things that they needed to do to shut that insurrection down, right? And a huge part of that was distorting the media, the control of the media. But again, in a country like the United States, they have given us so much access to this technology that as an improviser, right, we have to adapt, and we do, and we should. And, with a controlled or a revolutionary nucleus, that response is much more organized and intentional. And so he goes on to talk about that, and then we get into like page 162, where I was warned before this session. I was censored before this session to be.
Yes, we're censoring that. If you have this book and go to 162
through 166.
Yeah.
167. 162 to 167. There is very relevant information in there that is worth taking a note of.
On your own time, not in public on Zuckerberg's platform. You gotta know the lay of the land. That's what they talk about here.
Whatever. I'm just gonna read my underlying things, and I'm not gonna give context just to give you a taste. It's like a trailer. Within a matter of weeks or months, the government will be forced to announce a victory, having failed to produce one. That's what that's about. The army cannot be everywhere. Political embarrassment. The more radical elements of urban society will be emboldened. The government will grow progressively more fearful and repressive. The patterns described are observable. Is some hypothetical government immune to this? What we call the whites, aka cream puffs, and I was given explicit permission to say cream puffs, and I needed to say it. So cream puffs. We feel that when TV stop, when the telephone no longer rings, their world will almost come to an end. Like during a major air raid, they will stay in the house. They will sit and wait for television to come on. Da, da, da. Nor are urban industrial societies, however well policed, guerrilla proof. The guerrilla succeeds because he survives. He flourishes because his methods are progressive. Da, da, da. The object of okay. Don't laugh. This is at the bottom of page 167. This is about the United States military handbooks on irregular warfare techniques. Discuss various biological and chemical weapons that can be employed against guerrillas. These are recommended especially for situations in which guerrillas have mingled with an innocent civilian population that cannot or ought not to be killed. The object of so-called biologicals is to induce temporary incapacitating viral diseases that will reduce the ability of guerrillas to resist attack, so that infantry can rush into a target area and quickly kill or capture them without harming non-combatants. A device, so to speak, for separating the sheep from the goat. Various non-lethal gases carried like the biologicals in artillery shells and aerial bombs, or sprayed by low-flying planes, helicopters, have been designed for the same purpose: to sicken all within a given target area and so reduce resistance to infantrymen on their arrival without unnecessary bloodshed. I will say that this specifically, what I would say, another biological weapon that is super, super just like dismissed is our diet. They don't gotta spray shit when we eating shit. And when we eating shit and you can't you got the itis. My niggas know what I'm talking about. That shit, that's exactly what they talk about. You ain't ready to join no goddamn army when you can't get up off the fucking couch after every meal.
Bro, that's my weakness. I'm gonna tell y'all right now. I'm gonna expose that shit.
It's mine too. But as revolutionaries, we bring this information to the forefront and we say, hey, eat your fruits and veggies. Yeah. And so he goes on. I would suggest going through those pages and taking a more in-depth look at what quotes I'm referencing and why. And what happened, so then he goes into like what I pull out as like this like neo-colonialism that happens essentially as an extension of like certainly deemed it's essentially like less it's not considered inhumane to take these approaches, and so therefore compromises are often made in these instances. And the crux of the struggle is the social and political climate. The flea survives by hopping and hiding. He prevails because he multiplies faster than he can be caught or exterminated. And so when we look at Syria, right? We look at Syria, and there was like, accusations that the government was using these chemical weapons against the people and so forth. And we know that the United Snakes of America loves a proxy war.
Oh yeah, they do.
They love it because they don't have to be politically responsible for the violence that they are handing down to the people. They can say, "Oh no, that was Syria and some rebels and some other people. We gave them that shit, but we ain't really give them that shit. They was doing that on their own." But we know, as revolutionaries, we're gonna point out that contradiction as the bullshit that it is.
Bullshit.
And he concludes the chapter with people are in general. There are judicious uses of terror, no doubt, but no guerrilla can afford to use it against the people on whose support and confidence he depends for his life as well as his political existence. People are quick to detect the difference between opportunism and dedication, and it is the latter that they respect and follow. However, he also says, if enemies are to be disposed of, it must be for moral reasons. They must be traitors, murderers, rapists. The revolution must show that its justice is sure and swift. And by contrast, its enemies must be revealed as venal, weak, and vacillating. Those in doubt, even the adherents and servants of the regime, must be given a clear moral choice. Revolutionary propaganda must be essentially true in order to be believed. A high degree of selflessness, dedication, and high purpose is required. Insurgency is thus a matter not of manipulation, but of inspiration, right? He says their picture that, and then he goes on to say, I'm aware that such conclusions are not compatible with picture of guerrilla operations and guerrilla motivation drawn by the counterinsurgency theorists who are so much in vogue today. But the counterinsurgency experts have yet to win a war. At this writing, they are certainly losing one. Their picture is distorted because their premises are false and their observation faulty. They assume, perhaps their commitments require them to assume, that politics is mainly a manipulative science and insurgency mainly a political military technique to be countered by some other technique, whereas both are forms of social behavior, the latter being the mode of popular resistance to unpopular governments. Basically, these niggas lie to you to win your consent. And as those lies are revealed, as those lies are unveiled, they lose any type of ground that they stand on. And as revolutionaries, it is our job to tell the truth because that truth is in our interests, right? Ain't got no reason to lie. The world is fucking, we getting fucked over. That's the truth. And the government don't want you to know that because if they tell you that, then they have no ground to stand on. Period. Period. So this is the last chapter. We're gonna run through it. On we start at 11:30. Hour and about to come up on 2 hours, and we be quick. Chapter 11, summation, answers the question of what can colonizers do to avoid revolution. In essence, he says nothing. He says that they can't do shit outside of giving us what the fuck we want in order to eliminate the possibility of revolution. However, he does say that a type of neo-colonial relationship can be established in order to suppress revolution and as in like put it off for a later time, right? To slow down its progress. You introduce these like socially democratic efforts or what have you. I need some coffee.
Yo, I got my coffee too, but I just ran out. I'm sorry.
Gross. It's
delicious, dude. Stop.
And so he starts off this chapter with saying the United Snakes is naturally and necessarily allied with bankers, landlords, and investors everywhere. This is to set the stage to say that they gonna be the enemy regardless of if they want to or not. They are the landlords, the bankers, and the investors in our oppression. They are that. Just, position wise.
100. So people are really not fucking clear on that. Like when they think about bringing socialism or that kind of like political progression or whatever, they like envision a socialist America, which is a fucking fairy tale, dude.
Why? Why is that a fairy tale, Rob?
Oh, well, America in its day-to-day since its birth is economically based on exploitation of its own colonized populace and the exploitation of peoples everywhere. So that by nature, that exploitation of labor that sustains it, it's its blood. You know what I'm saying? When you take something's blood away, it dies. So that being its lifeblood, the exploitation of labor, that is the opposite of socialism. That is the opposite of socialism. If you want to instill socialism, you have to be 100% against America, I guess.
I was wondering how you going to conclude that.
I was going to say like something like more harsh or whatever, but again, I don't want to be zucked.
It is pretty plain. And he says the study of guerrilla movements of the post-war era leads to the conclusion that the United States is slowly moving into a worldwide conflict, which it cannot win. The reasons are not mysterious. This is what he said in the book. The reasons are not mysterious. As Rob has iterated, it is because every relationship that the United States has with any of these other nations is that of exploitation. It is that of exploitation. There is no socialism capable of happening because it is dependent upon that exploitation. And so, he's like, yeah, well, at some point you're going to have to come to the playground and face all your motherfucking people that you've been bullying. And that's just going to happen. It's just going to happen. And as we have seen, guerrilla war is popular war in one form or another. It is the struggle of nations against foreign invaders or rebellious segments of a society against the ruling classes of that society, of exploited against exploiters, of the governed against the governors, hypothetically. And so even in looking at that, you have, as we can see, where do the masses sit? Where do governments or these ruling classes sit in terms of the popular war? I mean, they're not very popular. Nobody really likes a bully. They may deal with it up to a point. You might have to deal with the bully, but nobody likes the bully. And so he goes in to say, he starts off the chapter with talking about indigenous people of North America and what was necessary and why the strategy of genocide in this case was utilized somewhat successfully in terms of the agenda of these like colonizers, right? And he essentially says that they were an inconsequential minority, alien in every way to the burgeoning white population. What was wanted was their lands, not their labor, their trade, or their goodwill. Consequently, they could be exterminated wholesale with no appreciable cost. Indeed, it was economically and politically desirable that this be done, and it was done, right? Genocide of indigenous people in America was a strategic one. It was more advantageous to create, and this gets and when we look at the establishment of America, right, it happened in twofold, right? If we want to put it plainly, right, the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of African people. And what they did, right, was eliminate the possibility of insurrection by massively wholesale slaughter of the population that they came into contact with. Obviously, indigenous people in America have survived, and that is the ultimate goal of any guerrilla, is to survive, to fight another day. They are still fighting. We are still fighting, right? But overall, that extermination agenda was put into place because they were like, we're just going to take your resources. And actually, we got this like external labor force coming in, right? Enslaved population that's going to do the work. So we don't really need to pacify you or to police you when we could just eliminate you, right? And so America was established on that foundation. At the same time, right, being establishing this like chattel slavery, right? And people reference slavery a lot. It's like, oh, slavery has happened before, but it was the introduction of chattel slavery, right? the absolute disregard for the humanity of an entire population of people, right? Not only metaphorically, but written into law. You are not human. You are not of the people. You are property. You are property, and everything that is produced from you is property of mine, right? Right. So there was no opportunity for Africans, brought into America to be born free. If you came out of a Black woman, you were a slave then until quote unquote abolishment of slavery. But as we know, as colonized people today, you are still a slave. You are still a slave. And so what he's saying is that that type of tactic is not used often, right? Because as colonizers, they came into America in an attempt to, it wasn't just as colonizers, they were claiming it as a nation of, or an extension of, this Western power. Whereas these other nations were colonial, they were extracting shit from these other nations. They were not trying to settle in these other nations, right? And so because they weren't trying to settle in these other nations, they needed those labor forces. They couldn't just wipe them out, because then they would have to do the work. And we know white people don't like to do work. So this example is one that is not often used, but can be, given the right pieces to the equation, to a certain equation. And it's what he defines as like kind of like a denial value, right? Just like at some point, it may not even be worth it to settle in a certain place if we in combines with it. So just to deny anybody else from having it, we're just gonna take this shit up, just knock it all the fuck out. That's like when somebody get mad at a game that they lose and fuck this shit. I'm gonna fuck this shit. Nobody gonna win if I can't fucking win. Like, and that's the essential approach that they take. But that's not often the case. That is not often the case. And yeah, I'm gonna open it up just for the intro. Rob, what do you think?
So I think that what you're speaking to is on point. I think that when we look at colonialism, there is the settler aspect to it. You settle on that land. The occupants of that land will be subjected to an extermination. And then when you have these other places that you just described where like they extract like labor and resources from, well, I guess that's still like a settler situation, but like it can also be understood like as another aspect of colonialism. Like it's part of the same motherfucking train, just like a different.
Yeah.
You feel me? But yeah. So I think that this chapter is really interesting because what it points to is a how do I put it? Like the separation of class, but like on a global scale. Because he's pointing to how people in the third world are tired of this motherfucking bully. You feel me? And like he says somewhere in here, like the Asians went through it, Africans went through it for sure, indigenous people went through it for sure, you know what I'm saying? And all that kind of tension is bubbling up, you know what I mean? And at the same time, like the internal contradictions of the imperialist nations are also uniting. You know what I'm saying? They're also like, I would say that like that social democratic movement that we're seeing right now is a further uniting of like the so-called white working class and the white bourgeoisie. Yep. You know what I'm saying? they're tying themselves together. They're getting rid of that contradiction. And at the same time, we as colonized people are coalescing to come to a dialectic, which eventually will come to a
head.
Yeah, like conflict, you know? And this is an old ass fucking book. And the fact that we're seeing it happen right now, you know? And the strategies that he's laid out as like a way to subdue counterinsurgency have already been implemented. So it's like, where do we go now? Naturally, it goes into the war itself, the actual conflict and the battle. So I really appreciated this whole motherfucking chapter for like bringing it on home, because I do feel like it speaks to our political line. Like when, like, after all is said and done, he has to speak to the colonizers' relationship to the goddamn colonized. There was something else too. I forget.
I believe that it will come to you in this summation as we move to the chapter. Fairly brief chapter, not too long. And he starts, after he sets that stage of like, you know, in this exception, right? And not necessarily an exception, but in this rare instance, right? Genocide, wholesale genocide is enacted, but often that is not the case, because it is politically not within the capacity of the state, right? They can't do it. The people won't support it. The masses won't support it, and they will face repercussions for that. But then he says, okay, so, you know, outside of genocide, what other tactics or strategies can these colonizers use to stifle revolution? And the last paragraph on 177, he jumps in. He says, in Africa, it seemed not long ago that the end of European colonialism and the emergence of new republics could be the beginning of an era of peaceful progress. In fact, the demise of colonialism on most of the continent now appears to have been not the end, but rather the beginning of revolutionary struggle, having as its object the destruction of an alien, or at any rate, all Western interest and influence. What he's speaking to is these neo-colonial forces that are still occupying these countries. This was in 65. This is still today, right? We see the almost total development of these neo-colonial influences in these other continents, on these other continents. And like you said, Rob, he references, you know, Congo specifically. He keeps saying underdeveloped countries, as we, you know, don't particularly use colonized nations, neo-colonial nations, or what have you. But he says, in all, without exception, it seems safe to say that revolution spreading like a subterranean fire by means of guerrilla warfare is not merely a possibility, but a virtual certainty. As the Black people, who are the vast majority in Africa, emerging from tribalism and peonage, discover that they can be neither ruled nor exploited without their consent. And I think that's so significant, right? Hegemony, right? Hegemony is like this, like, subconscious / conscious consent that we give to the ruling class. We follow suit because we've been told to follow suit. There is not a overt oppressive, like, somebody ain't standing at my door with a gun to my head or a threat of a gun to my head to follow these rules. You don't steal from the store because you're not supposed to, right? And so at some point we realized that, like, we can only be exploited and ruled with our consent, right? With the consent of the masses. And and so, you know, the United States and these other Western powers, I don't understand. No. have taken up neocolonialism as a means to pacify these other nations. And as he put it, it is not the end to those revolutions, but really setting the stage for the beginning. Nope. Don't be looking at me crazy.
So yeah, I 100% unite with that. And that's what I had fucking wanted to say before. Like, he pictures these kind of or he assesses these kind of situations as colonialism had stopped in Africa, and there's like still like these rebellious kind of rebellions still happening until they get rid of all the Western influence. And what I'm seeing is that he doesn't, and we've talked about this before, he doesn't have an understanding of the nature of neo-colonialism.
Not yet. Yep.
Yeah. So
makings of it. He's identifying like, they seem like they cool, but you know, you still have these corporate interests in there that are ultimately still controlling all of their resources, and they gonna you know, they may not be seeing white people marching around in like American gear occupying them, but they know they're still invested in, you know, that colonial relationship.
Yep.
So, and that's what I say when we talk about these nonprofits, certainly designed to pacify, certainly designed as an extension of, because it's like the common phrase, you catch more flies with honey. And these corporations that are located in these other countries, quote unquote developing nations, it's much easier and much more profitable to have these nonprofits in these areas providing this bullshit socialism, not even socialism, social work, rather than having guns to their head. Like, look, we'll hand out free lunches, you know, every other weekend. And, you know, you get 10 cents on top of that. Some bullshit.
You get a raise.
But he goes on to say, tomorrow's guerrilla armies in Africa and Asia and Latin America will be drawn from the ranks of the world's have-nots. The hungry peasants and the urban slum dwellers will meet the first requirement of the guerrilla, having nothing to lose but their lives. They will come from the productive labor force of the most exploited countries, and here the battle will be half won, for their labor cannot be obtained by killing them.
Blue.
Like you said, right in the introduction of this chapter, that there is this his understanding that he's coming to, that there is a global unity. He doesn't identify it as like colonized and colonizer, but we can see that today, that the reason why, you know, you have this mass movement on part of like these white liberals, and why Black Hammer particularly excludes white people from organizing, is because white people will almost, I'll take that out, will always have a vested interest in the work of the colonizers, right? Even when these niggas are scraping pennies and scraps up off the ground, they will have a vested interest in that because they believe and they see themselves in these colonizers. So whereas you have, you know, this middle class adjacent group of colonized people, they're still vulnerable to get shot in the streets. They, you know, even with their class, there's not a removal from the conditions as a colonized person, right? Regardless of where you sit. I mean, the fact that Oprah Winfrey is getting fucking followed in stores when she was trying to buy some bag in Europe, and she is like super, super rich. I mean, like, rich is an understatement. She is like, she got a lot of fucking money. You know what I'm saying? But even still, that money does not protect her from the fact that she is a Black woman, right? Even though she's a Black woman that's a sellout, right? So it is much more understandable for us to unite with that middle class adjacent, because they're gonna come to head with these contradictions one way or the other, right? Right now they may be in the feelings of like, oh, I can climb this ladder And at some point, because we understand the machinery of this, of colonization, of capitalism, and how it functions, we know there's a predictability that they will come to head. And as revolutionaries, as revolutionary nucleus, it is important to guide that ideology towards the investment of revolution rather towards an investment towards capitalism, right? And that's much easier done with that is much more reliable and sound with colonized people than it is with white people. White people are much more easily sold out in terms of like, oh, well, if I just get a little bit of land, if I just get a little bit of money, I'm cool. I'm happy. I'm content. I don't have to worry about my children's safety. I don't have to worry about the safety of myself or what have you, because I done made it. We don't have that luxury as colonized people, regardless of how much wealth we may or may not accumulate in our lifetime. I wouldn't even call it wealth because it really is like a drop in the bucket. Even these millionaires is a drop in the fucking bucket. And so he says, how will the gorillas be defeated when they are everywhere? They won't. They won't. And that's why I think, you know, and coming to the conclusion of this book, I'm always gonna be bringing it back to Black Hammer, because we do what we do for a reason. We are intentional. We have to understand the necessity of global unity of colonized people, because that question is still a very relevant question. How will we be defeated when we are everywhere? We won't. That's basically what he's saying. We won't be defeated. And so he goes on, he uses Latin America as this example to end out this chapter, because Latin America in proximity is very close to the United States, but also we derive a lot of, its proximity to the United States poses a huge threat. And it also has parallel conditions that are worth iterating. And all 20 Latin American republics, from Mexico to Argentina, varying only in degree, the same revolution breeding conditions exist. The same glaring discrepancies in the distribution of wealth, the same ghastly slums, the unemployment, the backwardness of rural areas, the corruption of nominally democratic government, the surging birth rate outstripping the annual rate of economic growth, and in all, the same high popular anticipation of progress that is in itself the greatest single impetus to radical political action. And so that last part is what he really focuses on, this anticipation of progress, and this idea that, like, as you are having these like socially democratic nations, right? And and that's like, you know, these neo-colonialist nations where we're providing these basic social reforms, but still also, you know, it goes hand in hand with that exploitation. These niggas feel they get it more ambition. They're like, well, shit, if I'm getting I got a formal education now, I'm making money, I got a job, why am I still seeing the same oppression, experiencing the same oppression? And so that in and of itself is like igniting of revolution. That in and of itself is what's going to radicalize certain populations, is the fact that, like, you created this social democracy and now I expect my rights. And when I don't have them, right, then you fucked up. You fucked up.
Here we go.
And we coming for you. He goes on to say on 183, poverty does not of itself engender revolution, but poverty side by side with progress creates new amalgam. The hope of social change, stimulated by even a little education, produces new social phenomenon. The ambitious poor, the rebellious poor, the cadres of the revolutions, who have nothing to lose and see much to gain around them. I could see Instagram, I could see all these motherfuckers with all this goddamn shit. And when I look around where I'm at physically, it's like, there is like very little that I could do to hope to get to that. And even if I get to that, I know my neighbor's not going to be able to get to that, or my homie. That it's like putting candy in front of a kid and saying you can't fucking eat it. No, it's like putting a fucking plate of food in front of a starving ass nigga and saying you can't have none, right? Because you know what I'm saying, like that is important and relevant today, even more so than it was then with the internets, interwebs. First of all, the poor have become poorer and more numerous and more desperate. There has been an unprecedented growth of population everywhere. I looked this up. So this was, again, written in 1965. He says, in the 20 Latin American republics taken together, the population rose from 163 million to 206 million in the years between 1951 and 1961 for an average annual gain of 4 million. An outlook for the population of 265 million more by 265 million by 1970. It is 2020, and the total population estimate from Google search of Latin America is 626 million, right? And that was in 2016. The population is booming. And that's why you have all this like population control rhetoric, like, oh, the globe can't sustain us. No, nigga, you can't. You cannot contain us. You cannot stop us. You cannot contain us. And the more social work you put in, the more we are able to constantly, and sufficiently support ourselves while we prepare to seize the means of production from you. And when you stop supporting us socially, that only ignites that further and expedience, whatever, makes that faster, makes that process takes place faster. So it's a lose-lose situation. You can continue with these social reforms, right? Housing, you got quote unquote, the welfare state. And I think he references that in this chapter, actually. And in the United States, it's like the welfare state. But out in other nations, it would be considered neo-colonialism, right? This liberal bullshit. Are we looking at comments? Do we have comments, Rob?
Somebody said that they about to make you a echinacea is like it's like a herb to help with coughing. Diva also said that we got fans all in the Philippines and shit.
We do.
Which is fucking dope. In reference to the global uprising against colonialism.
Fact.
And Diva had just said that they follow Diva, and she followed them back, and we started the chat, and they're like, "Oh, you do work with Black Hammer? Oh, I'm totally fangirling." Z. So our colonized people are dependent on us.
For sure.
To strike in the imperialist heart. And at the same time, we're dependent on them to strike at the imperialist arms. You did.
And those two things go hand in hand.
100.
They do. And so what he says is like awareness creates, if not a revolutionary class, then a revolutionary base. Economic progress, however limited, is a revolutionary force itself. Popular education, slowly spreading, stimulates emulation and social ambition. And again, right, that could easily be, and I think in the United States, that has been the case with this social progression, economic progression, is that you have a vast majority of people in the United States, colonized people, who believe still that they are working towards a proper integration into Western colonialism. But really, you still colonized. But in these other nations, it's more evident that there is more evident of that separation between colonizer and colonized, right? It's more evident. There's more. The effect of that plate in front of the hungry is a more evident effect, right? In the United States, there's like various avenues to kind of deter that realization, but like I said, there has to be a united front in terms of what we're doing here and what people are doing elsewhere.
Bring us on home, Z.
I will.
Bring it on home.
Yeah. So what is to stop it? What is to stop this like neo-colonialist bullshit? And on page 188, he talks about, since most Latin American countries, it is the middle classes and the growing class of white-collar proletariat rather than the workers and the landless peasantry that exercise revolutionary leadership. The chances are good that many instances popular movements could be diverted into more or less bourgeoisie liberal channels, replaced by liberal democracies based on limited socialism. We mean when we refer to welfare government, revolutionary pressures siphoned off by means of certain radical reforms, of which land reform would be the most obvious and immediate. He goes on to talk about the Cuban Revolution, and to compromise with revolution may well be to surrender the greater part of some 20 billions of vested interests in Latin America. 20 billion then, I'm sure, is far surpasses 20 billion today. But essentially, the compromise would consist, first of all, of continued certain access to vast supplies of vital raw materials. And so he's saying this in reference to the Cuban Revolution. He said if they had been wise, they would have supported Castro's liberal bourgeoisie movement when it was a liberal bourgeoisie movement, so that what could be instituted was like a social democracy in which they still could reap the benefits, the United States, rather than opposing it, in which they have severed that relationship altogether. And ultimately lost, right? They ultimately lost. The United States ultimately lost. And so what he's saying is like, well, if we look at that, we understand that, then we can understand that it is in the interest of the United States to support these social democracies in order to slow any type of revolutionary action. And that has been a successful strategy, right? In terms of instituting these social democracies. So he says, that compromise will consist of continued and certain access to vast supplies of vital raw materials on which the United States industry is absolutely dependent. Continued trade on a more equitable basis will be guaranteed, and with it, the promise of expanding markets for American manufactured products and agricultural produce, based upon the rising wages and consumption of millions freed from peonage and brought into the 20th century. You see that through the World Bank, right? These loans and whatnot that they give out to these different countries in order to insert American or Western corporations into these countries, essentially still controlling and maintaining that colonial relationship. On the one hand, progress, prosperity, and security. On the other hand, certain disaster. So on the one hand, if they support these social democracies, they can reap the benefits of them while still exploiting them. On the other hand, which is also, they don't have the choice anymore at this point, they will face certain disaster, right? There is only one outcome to guerrilla war, and that is revolution. And there is only one remedy, and that is peace. Some will call it surrender. If so, it is a surrender of force to reason, based on the understanding that no people can be subdued or kept in subjugation who do not accept defeat. And that is the end of that chapter. And I think, like I said in the beginning, that Robert Tabor doesn't really understand neocolonialism at this point, but we do. And it's important to understand that compromise that he understands to be towards peace really further grounds in that exploitative relationship, because we have now consented to that exploitative relationship, unknowingly so, but we have. And the masses, the working class, are the ones who suffer from that exploitative relationship. And it is the liberal bourgeoisie who thinks that they have something to gain from that relationship that really is making that compromise. Thoughts?
100. Again, when we talk about consent in our oppression, I think that it's imperative that we understand that we are under threat. You get what I'm saying? There is a threat that is overt to colonized people, not overt to colonizers. But when we do not struggle against our oppressive condition, then we are accepting our oppressive condition. And fuck that.
Okay.
So yeah, Robert Tabor laid out all these fundamental sciences to. He probably didn't write it to help us, but we are using his writing to help us get to that point where we are creating a ungovernable condition. You know what I'm saying? An uneasy base that no imperialist power can stand on. And that's really what I got in this book. And the reason why this book is one of my favorite, not only do I take its principles and apply it to my everyday work, but it also lays out how doable this is, which is super exciting and super fun. And I love this book, and I hope all comrades who are watching this pick this book up. I think that it's essential for anyone involved in this kind of work.
Well, what if it was this color? That would be dope. Anyways.
That is also kind of dope.
Yeah, no, I unite Rob. I think that this definitely may not have been written for us. I think that it is an observation based book, and that's what you mean when you refer to the science of the book of the stuff in this book. Is he is observing and he's being honest about his observations. Almost so to the strategy of the counterinsurgents. But ultimately, he concludes, regardless, the only way to stifle revolution is if the people allow you to. And as somebody reading it today, we have to be very particular on what we allow or accept from our government. From this government, rather, or from these colonial forces. We have to be conscious of that, even in the small and also in the largeness of it, because ultimately they are only able to do the things that they do if we refuse to struggle with them on those things, because they have no winning. They can't win. The solution is I mean, the conclusion is that the people have the power. Always.
100.
Unity.
So what's the next book y'all reading?
Okay. So I'm going to introduce Principles of Unity series. It is going to start not this next Sunday, but the following Sunday. And we will drop the book list then. Stay tuned, because we're going to drop that. We're going to have that out next week. But next week, for those of you who are in Black Hammer or ready to join Black Hammer, we're gonna have a deep study in which we go into depth, and it's called Forging the Hammer, just to build unity within the organization in terms of our principles. So we're gonna have a deep study called Forging the Hammer. It's going to be this next Sunday, and we will drop the book list then.
Right on. Anything else you want to do before we close this out?
Shimmy.
All right, y'all. Black Power. Thank you for sticking through this text with us, and hopefully y'all internalize and learn from this book. And we're gonna keep doing the damn thing. Tune in for our various programs on our social media. We have the book trap, we have propaganda, general meetings, always have political education. We're always putting out political education content.
And opening up conversations at our general meetings to talk about this, because we welcome, you to disunite with what we're saying so that we can bring us back to unity, right? Let us come back to unity, right? Have your opinions, but we're gonna struggle with you.
100. Well, all right, y'all. We'll catch y'all next week, and Black Power.
Black Power.